We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you want to go there. And as you do, I'll just read the text tonight. Somewhat familiar, I would think. First Corinthians 10, 6 through 14. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I was reading a chapter in a book by J.D. Greer, and a couple things I'm going to just give to you tonight. He started off asking these questions. He says, what do you feel like has to be present in your life to be happy? He means the kind of happiness that your life is really worth living. Money, praise and acceptance of others, which we mentioned tonight, power, friends and family. Is God what you most desire or want? Is he indispensable, the one you cannot do without in your life? How important is God's approval in your life? He continues to ask. Is God's acceptance of you the weightiest and most defining reality in your life? And then he says two other things, and I want to share it all with you. He has a definition of idolatry. Whatever takes the place of God in our lives. And later on he says, substitutes for God. Whatever we feel we cannot live without, it is that we think is absolute necessary for life and happiness. That's an idol, he says. Things we give the most weight to. It is usually, as I said a little earlier, it's a good thing that becomes a God thing. John Calvin says that our hearts, listen to this, are idol factories. Would you ever have considered before you heard that statement tonight, would you ever thought about your heart being that way? And as a believer, we can fight all that. But he says, you know what it is? Our natural tendency is that our heart is full of idols. And so he says that he has a 9-question inventory, so to speak. He calls it the idolatry detector test. And then I put it on the screen there. 9 questions that can ruin your day. And it will, believe me. I ask myself these questions. Here they are, one at a time. I'm going to look at the screen because I think it's bigger. Number 1, what is the one thing you most hope for the future? Now, if you were taking this quiz, or quote-unquote detector test, and you were writing down the answers, he said, and you can do this in your mind as you're thinking through as I say them, he said, if you answer the same answer 3 times or more, it's an idol. And that was one way to gauge what this can help you, figure out about yourself. So he said, what is the one thing that you most hope for in the future? And then he gives some ideas of what might be for people. It could be career success, which we mentioned tonight, a certain salary level that you got to obtain, that you own outright your own house, that you get married before a certain age, and your kids turn out to be successful. He said, is that the one thing you hope for in the future the most? Or if it's not those things, what is it? And ultimately, the question behind all the questions is it God? Number 2, what is the thing you most worry about losing? All of these indicate idols, if you haven't figured that out. What is the one thing you most worry about losing? One thing you can't do without: family, job, the love of your spouse, respect of your kids, retirement investments, losing out on the good life. Number 3, if you could change one thing about yourself right now, what would it be? And he puts down, is it your weight, your looks, your marital status, the job you have, your zip code, where you live, and how you live? With all of those things, if you could change them right now, do you really believe that they would give you the happiness that you're looking for? Number 4, this is a good one. What have you sacrificed for the most? Here's what. Listen to what he says. Sacrifice and worship almost always go hand in hand. In other words, what you sacrifice for the most is really what you worship. He says, as we said these tonight, I think Mike did, education, scholarship, having the perfect body, income levels, to be the absolute best at something above everyone else, attaining all the accomplishments that you have tried to and purpose for in your life. Number 5, who is there in your life that you feel like you cannot forgive? A friend, a business partner, a drunk driver, a spouse, a child that has left you bitter, someone who stole something from you that you feel like you could never replace. And then he says this, bitterness is always tied to idolatry. Always. Number 6, when do you feel the most significant in your life? When do you hold your head up the highest? What is it about you that you hope people find out about you? I'll say that one again. What is it about you that you hope people find out about you? What would you love people to say about you? Next one. When do you feel depressed the most? If your kids never call, marriage problems are not getting any better, getting older, still being single, you don't get the recognition that you think that you deserve. Then he adds this comment about depression. Depression often happens when sometimes we deem something essential for life and happiness, and it is denied us. So when the things you set your heart on that you think will really bring you the happiness you're looking for, and you don't get them, they're denied you, that's when we get depressed. Number 8, where do you go or where do you turn for comfort when things are not going well? I read an article on it this week. At the high on the list is go shopping. Anything that will give you pleasure, and they're not all good by any stretch. One of the main ones was pornography, food, substance abuse, and many, many others. Number 9, whose approval do you seek the most? Your friends, your family, people at church, people on your job, and on the list goes, he says. St. Augustine said this, things like money, fear, sadness, and deep depression, listen, they are the smoke from the fire rising from the altars of our idolatry. Let me say it again. Those things are the smoke from the fire rising from the altars of our idolatry. Follow the trail of the smoke, and you will find out what you have substituted for God. So you want to ask yourself tonight, don't you? Where's the smoke coming from? What are the fires that are going on the altar of your heart tonight? If you trace them, and by the way, if you're a very serious Christian, you should. Tonight we're going to do that a little bit. Where do they come from? What are the idolatries that are blowing off the heavy smoke in so many areas of our life? Well, I want to help you do that tonight by looking at our text together a little bit more. The definition we already heard of idolatry: anything that you make put in the place of God, a substitute for God. Anything that you value more than him or equal to him. Now let me set the text. Can I? If you turn to 1 Corinthians 10, there are a couple amongst the verses in the text that I read to you and a little bit before. There is two parallel situations, and there's a couple really important lessons I just want to press home for a minute before we get into the more serious things. Number one, there's a story about the golden calf. And it's an idolatry story. You know the story in Exodus 32. And by the way, we're not going to do it tonight, but if you preach the entirety of it, 3 times in Exodus 32, the Lord himself calls idolatry the great sin. The great sin. So if you had questions in your mind tonight that idolatry isn't that bad perhaps, or you thought it was bad but not that bad, can I tell you, God hates it. James was right. It is the first commandment, right? It is the number one thing to God, is that you don't have anybody else. And the reason why Scripture tells us is because he's a jealous God. But in our text, it's not only the golden calf incident, but he says thousands of people died because they committed with the people around them, the nations around them, they committed idolatry. And here's what was going on. In Numbers 25, if you read it for yourself, they were sacrificing with their gods and for their gods. And while they were doing it, they were eating and offered the meats that were offered to those foreign gods. Now, why does Paul put those stories in this text? Because it was a parallel statement to what exactly the Corinthians were going through all these hundreds of years later. They were in a town called Corinth. And there were lots of pagan temples, and there was a lot of people who had become Christians, especially the Gentiles, who went there and went in those pagan temples, took the meat and things that were offered to foreign idols, and they would pay for them, they would eat them and go home. Now, for Jewish people, that would be almost unheard of. So in this church, you have Jews and Gentiles alike, and so they were having troubles with that because they thought it was a wrong thing. And some people were hurting other people's faith because of it. But what's the similarity is both those stories, the Old Testament one and this New Testament one, is about people who were sacrificing in temples to the wrong gods, eating the foods that were offered to them. And that was the very issues in chapter 8 and 9 that lead into our chapter 10 that Paul was referring to. And thus he chooses these stories very purposely because he wants us to know this. Listen, number one, the Old Testament is not relevant. Not irrelevant, meaning this, that I think that in our day, and maybe it's you, I think that we are prone to spend the vast majority of our time in the New Testament, not because we shouldn't spend a lot of time there, because we do. But ask yourself, how well do you know the Old Testament? How well do you know the things, the stories, why they're there, the structures? Let me ask you this, do you know the Old Testament as well as you do the New Testament? Because I can tell you this, Jesus and the Apostle Paul and others use the Old Testament, obviously, exclusively. Tell the New Testament people what to do. So let me tell you this. I hope it inspires you tonight. I would know the stories of the Old Testament. And when I hear them, I could see, oh yeah, now I understand why that's a parallel. Or I can understand, see, there's lessons to be learned from those stories. And they're not just Aesop's fables with moral stories at the end of it so you can become a better ethical person. Oh, it's way more than that. Number two, can I tell you this? I think you have to get this generally from our passage. It is good for you to know your own history, isn't it? I mean, this is God's people, and back in the day, this is what God's people were like. And they had troubles with idolatry. And it wasn't just troubles. Thousands of people died because they couldn't take idolatry seriously. People died. Even in 1 Corinthians, there are some people who had died because they didn't take the Lord's table seriously. So you have to know your own history, don't you? You have to know what's going on in your life. And let me tell you this, you have to know what you're like and the problems that you've had in the past in your own personal life, because otherwise you won't be able to examine yourself correctly. If you go on doing the same things over and over again, falling for the same idols, the same temptations, the same allurements, the same desires all the time, you're not taking inventory of your life. The structure of our text, let me just give you some. We're not going to really do a lot with it tonight because we don't have time. But I want to give it to you so that you can do a lot with it when you examine your idolatry problems at home. Here's how it works. Chapter 10 and verse 6 and chapter 10 and verse 11, there are 3 sets of brackets in our text. Let me give them to you. The first one, 10:6 and 10:11, they both start with identical words. You can see them. Now these things. Verse 11, now these things. It's the exact same word in the original language, and in both instances, it is followed by the verb example. Why? Because Paul purposely wants you to see that these things are bracketed, and in between them are the examples. It's the word we get type from, typology. These stories of God's people in the Old Testament, he says, were not just written for them, they were written for us. That we would look at the examples. Don't you ever see, my dad told me this all the time. We'd have somebody at school or even at church, they would do something awful, they get in trouble, kicked out of school, and he'd say the old phrase, I know you've said this, at least what old people do. Now let that be an example to you, son. You ever see that? Oh, my dad said that all the time to me. He'd say, like, see, now see what happens when you do that, now you know. So if you do that again, you're never going to have an excuse for that. And I go, that's great to know, right? So examples, but these texts say this. See, now, look at these people. The idea is, let me warn you, Corinthians. See, you've read these Old Testament stories. Now you're accountable. Says, see, you don't become that. In fact, can you look at the verse? Look what he says in verse 7. Do not be idolaters. It's an imperative, a command. Let me tell you a little bit more. It's the word in the Greek that means to become something. And here's what he says. Don't you become an idolater. Don't you be like those people. Don't become it. And it's an event, but it's also in process. Can I tell you this? You can have an event where that's idolatry. But you know what happens when the idol really takes over your life? Let me tell you, it takes time. Just ask yourself, the day you started watching video games, you weren't playing it 10 hours a day. That was fun, that was great, an hour passed. But let it happen over time. You become an idolater where it controls you. And now you do it, you lose sleep to do it, you stay up till 2 a.m. to do it. Now you watch things that are wrong on the internet, pornography, and now you're hiding it from people, and you do this, and you cover up, and you have all these things you try to keep secretive. It doesn't happen overnight. He says, don't become idolaters. Look what happened to these people. Second bracket, 10, 6, and 11. Again, I told you now the words examples, and then our text in 10:7 and 10:14 both have idolatry and idolaters in it. It gives you the idea, and I'm not going to say this with absolute confidence, but it wants to say the things in between there and the things that were before it were all different forms of idolatry. Because you can see in our text, there are 4 different things that are mentioned here. And it is idolatry, sexual immorality, testing God, and complaining. And when you think about it, and think, in fact, beyond this text, pretty much almost any sin you could think of is idolatry. What was the problem that they had? That Paul had to pull up these stories and give them these imperatives. And there are 2 imperatives. Don't become idolaters. And the second one is also about idolatry. In verse 14, he says, flee from it. So take notes tonight. Here's your strategy. In this text, we get 2. Sometimes, he says, don't become it. So that's at the beginning. So don't start going down the roads that you know that will turn into things that will control you and take over your life. So here's what you do. You resist. This is a beginning strategy, right? Then he says, sometimes because you go to work every day and you have faced certain people or certain situations that every time you go to work, it's going to be there. So sometimes you have to resist, but sometimes, though, you have to run. So he says, flee idolatry. So sometimes you have to stay there and withstand it, and sometimes you have to run from it and get completely away from it. Let me give you an example. Old Testament. Who am I going to say? Say it. Joseph. So remember what it said about Potiphar's wife? Every day she tried to make advances on him. Day after day after day. What is that? That's resisting. Resisting the temptation. But there was one day that when he was caught alone for it, but by the way, which he tried not to let happen. But why? Because he's resisting. But one day it was just him, and she came in the room, and it was the two of them by themselves. And she grabbed his coat of whatever he was wearing. And what did he do? He runs. Can I tell you, you need to have both of those defenses in your arsenal when it comes to idolatry. Idolatry, sometimes we just resist the best we can with God's help, and sometimes we run. But there's a situation, and I want to close with this, that was the biggest problem. And one author, Paul Gardner, in his commentary, he called it the Corinthian problem. And he says it's in verse 12. Let me read it for you. Therefore, what's therefore? Therefore, based on the examples between verses 6 and 11, between when they gave into sexual desires or idolatry or grumbling and complaining, when they gave into that and all those things happened, what do we learn from it? We would say, hey, thanks for the sermon, verses 6 through 11. Verse 12 is the application. What is it? He says, therefore, or literally so then, let the one who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Listen to Paul Gardner. The problem was they assured themselves that because they had all the spiritual blessings, that they could never be in danger of God's judgment. And then he says this, you can think that you're secure when you're not. You know what the insidiousness of idolatry is? It's deceptive. It's deceptive because you think that when you get what you want and make it the idol that you'll finally be happy, but in the end you're empty. It's deceptive. It gives you everything that you want up front and you get nothing back at the end. That's what it's about. He says, you can think that you have all the spiritual, and Corinthians did. They had every spiritual gift. Read 1 Corinthians for yourself. They had every gift that you could possibly imagine. They were blessed by God in spiritual blessings beyond any other church in the New Testament. But they also were the most carnal, fleshly, ungodly a bunch of Christians that there ever has been in the New Testament. And he says this, take this warning, and it's the word this, watch yourself. Watch out for this. It'd be a warning, a serious warning. Here's the warning. Let no one who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Obviously, those are the two things. They are opposites of one another. Because when it comes to idolatry, there's two options. You're either standing or you're falling. And there's not a whole lot in between. In the New Testament, standing and falling are always used as opposites of one another. And the vast majority of all the times that standing is used, it means to stand before God. In other words, you are standing before God and He is accepting and approving of the life that you're living. And fall is the opposite. In fact, fall is often used to describe someone who is apostatized. That they've gone away from God. They don't believe in Him anymore. They don't follow Him. They don't say that they even know Him anymore. You see why he's serious and why there's such a warning? He says you're either standing before God and He's pleased with you, or in your idolatry you are falling away from Him and you might have judgment coming. What Paul makes very clear in this text is when he says standing, he doesn't mean that you can do it all by yourself. In fact, in the New Testament, standing is required by God, but at the same time, it is enabled by God. So he gives you the power to do it. He gives you the ability to do it so that you won't fall into sexual immorality. You might not test God or Christ, that you might not keep complaining and griping about what God is doing and not doing in your life. If you haven't figured it out yet, idolatry is extremely dangerous, obviously with God. And then he says this, that root problem of idolatry, can you look at it for me? Now these things took place, verse 6, for our examples, that we might not circle it and highlight it. We might not desire evil. Let me give you a little quote. Idolatry is always first a desire before it becomes a deed. Always. So this idolatry problem that we have, as it says in Ezekiel and other places, it is a heart problem first, and then it becomes a hand problem. It is something that we do. And so what we have to do to fight idolatry is not just say, hey, I'm going to stop trying to do these bad things. I'm going to stop trying to look at this. I'm going to stop reading that stuff. I'm going to stop, and you name all the things that you could name. You're starting on the outside. That's not how idolatry is defeated. It starts on the inside, and you have to start on the inside. You have to figure out, what does the Bible say about how someone can change their desires? Idolatry is an inside-out solution. It needs one. So that's why he can say, being verb, don't become idolaters. Don't be that kind of person. Don't be someone who names Jesus, but on the inside, you are just controlled by all of your fleshly and carnal desires. He says, don't be that way, because remember what happened to people who couldn't control themselves on the inside. And he mentioned story after story about they were destroyed by Satans. This many thousand people died, and it's really graphic for not being visual. And it says, and their bodies were strewn across the wilderness. And the idea is like the smoke trailing off of the fires of our idolatries on the altar. It's like their bodies were littered all through. It's like you could follow the trail of idolatry because people's corpses were laying there. And I can't tell you as a pastor, I couldn't tell you all the people that I can tell you that are ruined, and they're people who have been in the war and they have been defeated and lost their marriage, lost their kids, lost their jobs, lost their lives. And they are casualties of war that they weren't willing to win. How do you do it then, Pastor Walker? How do you stand and not fall? Well, the scriptures don't leave us hanging, and I'll close. The verse says in 13, no test, not a temptation like temptation to sin, because James 1 says God doesn't tempt anyone. Only the devil does that, or our flesh. No test has taken you that is not like everybody goes through. In other words, you're not going through any test that someone else hasn't been before you. But here's the two things. Ready? God is faithful. What is he faithful to do? To provide you the way of escape. So you know how you overcome idolatry? On the inside, you have to know this. God is faithful to me, and he has the power to give me the ability to endure it if I have to. So if I have to resist and I can't run, he'll help me. If I can run, he will protect me. And what I believe about this text is it says this, that this is what it means to stand and not fall. Because the text says this, he will not let you be tested beyond your ability. And that is not, listen, that is not your ability isolated from God. Did you read it? Your ability is equal to what God can do, not what you can do. He says what you need to know about God and your idolatry and the temptations and testing is that this, God is faithful. And the way that he shows his faithful is not ever let you get in those spots. It's not to immediately get you out of those spots, but when you're in them, that you can resist it. See what he says? He'll not let you beyond your ability, but in contrast, the testing, he will provide the way of escape. There will be a way if you're willing to make the cost, pay the cost, to run and or resist. Can I tell you, honestly, if you do, it will cost you at times to serve the one true God and not let any other gods be in your life. Joseph cost him 3 more years, 3 years in prison. 3 more years. After the butler and baker, it was 2 years. But he was in that prison for 3 years. Why? Because he resisted. Because he ran. Because he said, I have no other God before me. That's what it will cost you. But Joseph, you know how the story ends. God made a way for him to escape. And God gave him the ability to endure it. And from the time he was sold in slavery to the time he was second in command, you know how long it was? 13 years. That's a long time. But that's how you know that God is your God and there is no other, is that when you live a life like that, no matter what it costs, one God and one alone. Let's pray. Father, tonight, may we heed the commands and imperatives. Flee. Oh, the New Testament is laced with that command. Fleeing so many things. As G. Campbell Morgan once said, the best way to resist the devil is the king's shoes and the king's highway. Father, may we be willing to take that and run. May we teach our kids, run. Oh, Father, may we run away from sin and may we run to you, that we might every day choose this in our lives by your grace through faith. You are the only God that we worship. Help us to live that way for your glory, your infinite value and worth, for Christ's sake. Amen.